Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the meeting of the South and West Plans panel. My name is Councillor Hannah Bithell, and I'll be chairing today's meeting. Could I remind everyone that today's meeting is being live streamed on the Leeds City Council YouTube channel so that the public can observe the meeting without needing to be present. South and West Plans panel deals with applications from the south, northwest, and west of the city. The aim of the panel is to hear all the relevant information from applicants, members of the public and council officers to help members of the panel make their decision. However, today we're here to discuss a position statement seeking members' views on the proposal at this point in its development. Could I therefore remind members of panel that there will be no vote or requirement for a formal decision? Could I now invite members and officers to introduce themselves and mute your microphone once you've introduced yourself? If we could start from my left, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Littlejohn and I'm the Planning Case Officer.
Good afternoon. My name's Adam Ward. I'm the team leader for South West team.
Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Chimulian. I'm from Highways.
Good afternoon. Councillor Paul Ray from Huntlet and Riverside Ward.
Good afternoon. Councillor Kaylee Brooks, Little London and Woodhouse Ward, and I'm substituting for Councillor Bromley today.
Good afternoon, Councillor Taylor from Chapel Allerton Ward.
Afternoon, Councillor John Garvani, Horsforth Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Andy Rowntree, Coxter Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Manaka from Bermondsey and Richmond Hill.
Afternoon, Paige Carpenter, Planning Intern at Leeds City Council.
Good afternoon, Daniel, part of the Plans panel team.
Good afternoon, Councillor Lynn Buckley, Woodley Ward.
Good afternoon, Rhiannon Stiller on WAC Experience.
Hi everyone, I'm Natasha and I'm the clerk to the panel.
Good afternoon, Nick Dio, Legal Advisor to the panel today.
Good afternoon, Jonathan Carr, Head of Development Management.
Steve Butler, Group Manager for South and West and Lead Office at South and West Plans panel.
Lovely, thank you everyone and welcome. Moving to the agenda, could I ask the clerk to go through agenda items number 1 to 5, please?
Thanks, Chair. Agenda item 1, there's no appeals. Agenda item 2, no exempt items. Agenda item 3, no formal late items. Agenda item 4, can members declare any interest? Agenda item 5, apologies from Councillors Smith, Bromley and Campbell. Councillor Brooks is here, substitute for Councillor Bromley today. And I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Item number 6 then, minutes of the previous meeting held on the 8th of June 2023. Do members accept these minutes are a true and correct record? Lovely, some nods. I'll assume they're correct unless indicate otherwise. And are members happy to move these? Move. And Councillor Rowntree to second. Thank you. Are there any matters arising from them? No? Lovely. So we'll move on to agenda item number 7, which is Cartwright House, an application for demolition of existing building and construction of a 36-storey residential development with ancillary commercial space, landscaping and external amenity space. Can I ask the officer to present the application, please?
Thank you, Chair. So the proposals for the demolition of an existing industrial building, as Chair just mentioned, construction of 36-storey residential building to house 402 apartments with ancillary commercial space to the ground floor and an external podium level garden area which connects up with the adjacent development. The application sites towards the Whitehall Road end of Springwell Road in Holbeck, adjacent to a previously approved development on the corner of Whitehall Road and Springwell Road that's 224 apartments over a maximum of 16 storeys, stepped up from 6 storeys. A version of the current proposal was put before City Centre panel at pre-application stage back in 2019, before the pandemic. This was for a 24-storey development of a different design and is relevant insofar as members indicated that they were supportive in principle of a tall building in this location. The applicant's presentation at this time included a 30-storey option, but the proposal description did state 24 stories, and that's what was carried through to the minutes. Due to the length of time since the original pre-app and the number and nature of the changes to the proposal, it's being put forward as a position statement at this stage, with members being asked to look at various aspects of the updated proposal. The site's located just to the south of the city centre area, the boundary of which follows the railway line at this point, so it falls within the city centre fringe. It's relatively modest in area, given the number of units proposed, and comes in at around 1/3 of a hectare. Located on the western edge of Holbeck, in a commercial setting, with the railway siding currently housing a facility which processes and exports aggregate derived from road sweepings. Sweepers come in by road and the processed materials exported by rail. This is 190 metres to the northeast, with a low-rise office block adjacent to the east. A number of light industrial units occupy the area across Springwell Road to the north. This shows the site in the context of Holbeck, with newer developments in Holbeck Urban Village to the east, and most of the traditional residential areas located somewhere to the south, which is also where most of the community's green spaces are. Within the neighbourhood plan, the proposal site's in an area encouraged for commercial uses, although the relevant policy doesn't preclude residential development, which would be given further weight by the development approved next door, which is currently being built out. The current proposal is being presented by the applicant as phase 2, with shared elements, including the podium garden and servicing arrangements. Both sites are accessed off Springwell Road, and being on the junction with Whitehall Road, is easy access into the city centre, either by public transport, walking or cycling. This is the proposal site from across Springwell Road in the context of the adjacent step development and the emerging development across the railway line on Whitehall Road to the north. This is for further along Springwell Road, again showing the wider context. And this is from the junction between Springwell Road and Whitehall Road, the first phase of the development being almost built out. Members are being asked to come to a view on continued support of the principle of development, along with the height at 36 stories and the design and use of materials, all of which are new elements. This mock-up shows the relationship between the two phases, with the applicant choosing to go with the contrasting materials and design, an approach that's considered to be potentially to have merit in the Tall Buildings Design Guide. And this shows the impact on the wider skyline of Leeds, with the Springwell Road buildings forming part of a cluster with other blocks to the north. Although clearly the proposed building will be taller than those other blocks, it also shows the relationship between the proposed building and Bridgewater Place to the east, both of which would be seen as gateway buildings from different approaches into the city. And this is just to show the version which was previously considered by members. This is a graphic showing the context of the city skyline, with the application site falling within an emerging cluster of taller buildings. Again, the Tall Buildings Design Guide suggests there could be merits in establishing buildings in clusters at different heights. And this shows the pattern of new development in the city moving increasingly to the south. Notably, there's an approval for a 32-storey block at Midlands Mills, directly to the east, about equal in terms of distance to the south of the city centre. And this shows, this was taken from Upper Wortley, showing how the building would sit within the skyline from a distance. It shows the site's relationship to nearby conservation areas, The applicant has submitted a heritage assessment, which concludes that there'd be less than substantial harm to heritage assets, meaning any harm would have to be outweighed by the benefits of the proposal. In this case, there are some quite significant benefits to the locality in terms of regeneration, off-site green space, cycle infrastructure, and provision of housing that would weigh against the harm. Members are also being asked for the views on the provision of green space in line with policy G4. This policy does allow for off-site provision, and in this case, all of the requirement is to be provided as a commuted sum, which would be just short of £500,000 to be put towards improvements of green infrastructure in the locality. The neighbourhood plan outlines areas in which improvements are being sought, with the proposal site sitting within an area known as SG1. This covers the whole area north of the viaduct, and while no actual land's being given over for green space, it's hoped that funding could be put towards ongoing or new projects within this area. With regard to the proposed building itself, members are being asked to come to a view on design and materials. The applicant's gone for a simple but distinctive form with a brick base, which would include an active frontage made up of the building's entrance and the entrance to the commercial element next to it, and a crown feature at the top, which would be glazed. The main body of the building would be made up from glazed units and metallic ventilation panels, creating a surface which would respond to shifting light conditions throughout the day and have variation within the surface itself. And this shows how these design elements translate to the views at ground floor level, with an active frontage being provided by the building's foyer and the adjacent commercial unit fronted in brick. This image shows the frontage without the proposed wind mitigation, which, as you can see from this model, the amount and variety required is substantial, a concern which has been raised by ward members. And again, members are being asked for their views on this in terms of the model in itself. The applicant's wind report has been peer reviewed and everything stacks up with regard to amenity and safety. But ultimately, the amount required is fixed, and a view will have to be taken on whether or not the street scene would be unduly cluttered. Final details can be dealt with by condition, but what we have so far looks quite promising in terms of providing an interesting feature at ground level, consisting of a combination of sculptural forms and more linear types of screen. And this is just from a slightly different angle, showing how the spacing would open up views of the frontage for pedestrians as they walk past. Highways still have some concerns about whether or not the structures would oversail highway land, which includes the footway, shown here in a darker colour. It looks from this image as though the issue can be resolved quite easily, subject to more accurate measurements being taken, which show the highest point of the structures to be within the applicant's side of the footway. Members are also being asked about their views on the relationship of the proposed development with Phase 1, otherwise known as 1 Springwell Gardens. The applicant's keen to point out that the design is intended to minimise the dominance of one building over the other, with the layout providing good levels of sunlight, at least in the communal outdoor areas. In terms of the impact on the apartments themselves, there are currently no sunlight assessments submitted other than what's being shown. A brief glint and glare document has been recently submitted, but this relates only to the impact on the adjacent railway line and doesn't touch on the amenity of residents. Having said that, the distances between windows are generous at 35 metres, which would avoid issues of overlooking. The orientation of the buildings forms an important part of the relationship, as is the physical connection between the two, as I've previously mentioned, at podium level, with a shared outdoor garden area. Exactly how this connectivity will function is questionable, given that a partition has to be placed down the centre for wind mitigation purposes. However, the adjacent site was approved on its own merits, and in this case, as a standalone amenity serving the residents of the application building, it works well enough, providing a good level of biodiversity net gain and reasonably private, elevated communal space. With regards to vehicular servicing and access, there is a further connecting element between the two sites, with most of the servicing arrangements being provided within the adjacent development. The site offers 18 parking spaces, all EV connected, along with 3 car share spaces being provided on street and 2 disabled spaces, in line with policy requirements. The location is considered to be close enough to the city centre to be able to sustain a low level of parking. There's to be ample provision of cycle stands in the basement, which, subject to final details being agreed by condition, should accommodate every apartment. Negotiations are also underway for a commuted sum to be put towards cycle infrastructure along Whitehall Road. And members are asked for the views on this as an adequate offset to the low level of parking. Moving to the internal layout, members are also being asked for the views on the level of amenity being provided for residents, and along with spaces on the top floor, which I'll come to shortly. The first floor provides access onto the podium garden and also provides a gym and swimming pool. The gym occupies a mezzanine floor in the foyer area and also has views out onto the podium garden. The living accommodation starts at level 2. The apartments are policy compliant in terms of room sizes and accessibility, and members are asked to comment on the housing mix, which comes in at 10% 3-bed, 42% 2-bed and 48% 1-bed, which is consistent with other developments of this scale and type in the city centre. The first 30 floors provide a mix of 1 and 2-bed units. 7% affordable units will be provided across floors 2, 3 and 4, amounting to 26 out of a total provision of 29. This does generate a degree of clustering which wouldn't necessarily be in line with policy H5, but it's all being provided on site, and members are asked whether that would be acceptable, given that there are often viability cases put forward against on-site provision. A further 3 by 3 bed affordable units will be provided at floor 30. Here the clustering is more understandable, given that all of the 3-bed provision for the development is to be on the top 3 floors, with the top floor being given over to the larger duplexes with roof terraces. As I mentioned, there are also further communal areas on this level, including an open terrace with planting to provide some sustainable drainage options, and 2 further roofed areas, one of which is being called the Sky Garden, although it does have a roof. That's the Sky Garden, and that's the open terrace. Just a final note on the proposal's green credentials. The construction methodology minimises the heating requirements for the development, which will then be met in part by a combination of solar, photovoltaic cell and passive heat sources. Average improvement in the emissions rate is 36.14%, and average energy provision from low carbon energy is 10.36%, which is all in line with policy. So just to conclude, I'll go through the questions one more time. Question 1, do members continue to support the principle of a residential tower in this location? Question 2, if so, Do members support the height of the tower at 36 stories, sorry? Question 3, do members support the design of the tower, including use of materials? Question 4, do members support the proposed housing mix? Question 5, do members support the provision of affordable housing across floors 2, 3, 4 and 30? Question 6, do members consider the levels of amenity provided for residents to be sufficient? Question 7, do members consider the relationship between phases 1 and 2 to be acceptable? Question 8, do members consider the provision of funding towards local green space projects an acceptable alternative to on-site provision? Question 9, are members happy with the low level of parking being offset by the requirement of a contribution towards cycling infrastructure? And question 10, do members consider the amount of wind mitigation required and the emerging design solutions acceptable in principle? And with that, I'll hand back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'd like to now invite the applicants from ID Planning to come and address the panel. And once you're ready, there'll be 4 minutes available for you to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name's Andrew Windrus from ID Planning. I'm joined by Nick Brown from Nick Brown Architects, the architect for the scheme. So we'll speak quite briefly on behalf of City Life, the applicants, who, as we've talked about, are also the developer for phase 1. Nick will talk more so about the design, but then we're, of course, available for any questions. I think Steve's covered absolutely everything in the presentation, referenced all the policy points and being compliant in all those technical matters with respect to highways, other air quality elements, the NDSS, and then also providing the full affordable housing provision intended to be on site, plus the green space contribution. So we won't repeat too much of that. I do probably just want to emphasise the developer is obviously delivering phase 1, and you'll have seen that on the site visit today, and I'm sure when you're around and about in Leeds, and that's coming forward very well, nearing its completion, with the intention, hopefully, of course, to move on to this site next door as part of that important phase 2 that's always been designed that way. So I'll hand over to Nick, who will talk about the design rationale a little bit further.
Thank you, Chair. As Andrew said, the report, the description of the development is fantastic, and we've got very little to add really to the officer's presentation. The only thing a couple of things I will add, just in terms of some of the questions that were sort of raised. I'd like to provide the confidence that the mitigation can sit within the boundary. There was a question about just whether the mitigation oversailed the footpath. We've worked to ensure that the mitigation does sit wholly within the boundary, so it doesn't affect the footpath and the potential concerns from the highways department. The other small point I would make is there was a question about the partition between phase 1 and phase 2 at the garden level. Obviously, the connectivity between the two phases is very important for the client, and architecturally it's very, very important as well. There is a partition, but there are gaps within that partition to allow the residents to walk between the two areas of the garden space. So I just felt it was important to mention that. And then finally, and again, you know, the description was perfect, really, in terms of our approach to the design. We were sort of challenged by the client to create a building which really complemented the architecture of phase 1. And we felt to do that, the best way was to create a tall, slender attractive building which provides it was created of materials which complement the brick of phase one. We've brought the brick plinth through, so there is a visual connectivity between the two buildings, but then it's a very different contrasting materials with the reflections of the glass and the white aluminium cladding of the insulated panels and the ventilation panels within the facade, and the orientation as was presented of the tall building allows the daylight within the garden space to be optimized. It increases separation distances between the two buildings, but the other point is that the orientation actually, in terms of the civic side of things, makes the building align with Whitehall Road, and therefore the developments that sit along Whitehall Road. I mean, we see this as a natural extension of the development growth down Whitehall Road, and sort of pioneering element that's within Holbeck, and hopefully encouraging other high quality development to come forward in Holbeck. So that alignment with Whitehall Road and the buildings, and so there's a natural sense of the buildings working together across the cityscape as another important aspect, and that's me. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'd like to now invite any members to ask questions to officers on this application. Councillor Brooks.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So the wind mitigation side of things, right? How many trees could be fit in instead of that wind mitigation? And how policy compliant is a wind mitigation sort of trumping the trees that can be provided on site?
It's fine, Councillor. In terms of wind mitigation, we're not really supposed to use natural trees for safety purposes, because they can come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So we would require those structures to be there. So do you mean that you would want trees as well as those structures?
Yeah, sorry, Chair. What I meant was how many trees could be fit in on the site if the building wasn't designed to require that level of wind mitigation?
Most of those mitigation elements are at the front, which would be on an apron anyway. And I think there are quite a lot of, the planting is sort of more on the podium garden area. And some of that does have a wind mitigation function, because it doesn't pertain to the highway. So it wouldn't necessarily be planted up anyway, because you'd be sort of on the main frontage. So there might be some street trees, but there wouldn't be a significant amount of planting, I wouldn't have said.
Can I just jump in there briefly? Sorry. It's a really difficult question to answer, is that, Councillor Brooks, because actually, obviously, I need to remind members we're here to discuss the scheme that's been presented rather than to discuss it down as such. But the thing is, the requirement for wind mitigation is above 8 stories, Steve, is that correct? Or was it 6?
I believe it's 8.
So that kind of answers your question. To have trees there and no wind mitigation at all, you'd be going way, way down. And that's way below what was discussed at the previous pre-application stage, which I know most of which is irrelevant. But the one thing that was taken away from that this area was suitable for a tower, but not necessarily specifically the exact height. but yeah, the only way to achieve what you're suggesting is to take it right down to 6 stories, to be honest with you. It's not really a question that can be answered, to be fair, especially with the background of the sort of agreement that a tower was acceptable in that location. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question then, in terms of the wind mitigation on the street scene, right? Has anything been done to assess pedestrian safety in terms of walking through the area, if like visibility of those pedestrians and natural surveillance, and how that's going to impact on it?
I would say there's still work to be done on that. The imagery we've got is quite recent. There are some plans which we'll be looking at. It'll be for colleagues in highways to scrutinise it, but we've not got that level of detail just yet. But we would expect that would be looked at quite closely. Yeah.
Again, Chair, just to chip in and apologise for this, and we also do, of course, have an in-house access officer that will obviously be consulted on the scheme ultimately when we're a bit more firmed up on exactly how many structures that are required of that nature. Because I understand the point that if you're visually impaired, obviously that's quite a lot of the stuff there. But yeah, the access officer will be consulted on the proposal before it comes back to panel.
One more, Councillor Brooks. Then I've got to bring Councillor Ray on.
Sorry, it's on the same thing. I wasn't speaking specifically only about access. I was also talking about the safety of pedestrians circulating around the building and whether the structures would be detrimental to natural surveillance or not. So more about the safety and security of people as well as the accessibility issue. That's all.
What we've got proposed so far, if you notice, the almost like champagne bowl type lattice flutes are quite permeable visually. There are some more traditional structures hidden amongst the screens, but those are actually lifted high on panels to deflect the wind before it gets down to the ground. So I think along the ground level at sort of human scale, I think the visibility would be there that Councillor Brooks is seeking.
Thank you. Councillor Ray?
Yeah, it's on a similar vein of points. I suppose the question is, the principle of a tower is kind of been pre-agreed in the previous application, so that's fine. So that, to a certain extent, that kind of deals with itself. But we are talking about the scale, and that the scale is dictating to a certain extent the significance of the wind mitigation measures. Because I did notice the things on. It's a lot, and that is going to have a significant visual impact as well as in the area. Is that, and I know that the answer to this question, I'm going to ask it anyway, is the sheer amount of wind mitigation because the tower is so tall, because it's a lot. And it's a lot on the street scene, and it's a lot of stuff shoved onto columns in the air to try and make that. It's just a lot. I suppose I already know what the answer to that's going to be, but just for public record, is there so much because it's so tall?
I'm not sure it's just the height, but certainly the height plays into it. There'll be an impact with the accumulation of buildings in the area. There's an impact with the shape of the building, all of which would require mitigation. And clearly we need to have a situation which is safe. So yes, but there'll be other things to look at as well.
Just as a follow-on to that, because obviously the orientation of the building has an impact on the wind. Obviously the applicant said why they want the building orientated in that particular way. Have other orientations of the building been looked at that would mitigate the need for the amount of wind mitigation to try and help reduce that?
My understanding from discussions with the applicant is that that particular orientation was chosen because of the wind, and that's the best way for it to be located for wind mitigation.
And on a different topic, This is very near or getting very starting to get very close to more traditional residential areas, which obviously have a much lower footprint. Putting a very large building near industrial units, which will probably eventually be developed at some point, therefore starts moving the height demographic of that area much closer to more traditional areas. What impact on policy will this have in future, on future consideration under our current policies about the heights of those buildings as we get closer to the more traditional residential areas? Will it have an impact? Effectively, will it set a precedent that we have to consider for future applications in the area?
So I think, as Steve mentioned earlier in his presentation, it is within an area that we have designated as a potential for a cluster of tall buildings, but obviously it's recognised the proximity to the rest of Holbeck further to the south. There's still quite a distance, actually. Yeah, it'd be helpful if we could display that image again. It is still quite a distance from the lower residential buildings further to the south. And as you mentioned, there are quite a number of industrial buildings between the two. So it might be quite some years before we get anywhere near approaching those residential buildings of a lower scale, but take the point. And as Steve mentioned earlier on, we are seeing a sort of an increase in the number of taller buildings getting closer to this particular site, so that it won't necessarily be an outlier for much longer, in the sense that taller buildings on the fringe of the city centre are creeping towards this particular site. So take the point though.
So I suppose the question was, and I appreciate the answer, is it going to create effectively a precedent where developers can come to us and say, actually, there's a demographic of building in this area. I want to put a really tall building right next to those 2 or 3 story buildings, because actually there's only a building 200 metres away, which is of a similar height.
Well, the answer to that is no, it wouldn't set a precedent, because we look at each site and its particular impacts on its own merits. So we'd certainly take into account the proximity to those residential properties.
And again, we look at each one, but we also look at the context of the area and actually take that as a material consideration. So if you have lots of tall buildings there, that is a material consideration in terms of what is and is not acceptable. So I understand your point that everything is on its own application, but actually we're shoving a really, really, really big tower not a million miles away from short residential properties. And I suppose the question for us as panel members is actually, do we feel the stepping? Completely agree, it's an acceptable area for tall buildings, but actually what is the stepping as you go from that smaller residential area to that bit? And then that has a relationship kind of impact on what else might be considered acceptable. So I know it doesn't set a precedent, but does it create a material planning consideration when other large applications come forward?
I think, Chair, yes, it does, of course. And I think Jonathan covered the point, really, that because most of the traditional residential is to the south and beyond the railway line, I think that intersects there. The likelihood here is it would step down ultimately any further development, because you would have to, as mentioned about taking into account the material consideration, individual properties, you would have to look at the amenity impacts on anything that was significantly lower. So the likelihood, and the fact that it's peripheral anyway, as we mentioned before, it would step down. Any further development is likely to step down. And of course, the likelihood again, if it was tall, it'd be coming back to Panel for consideration. So I think that probably answers it.
Thank you. Any further questions to officers, members? Councillor Brooks?
There we go. Sorry. Right. So I'm quite concerned about the lack of an overarching sort of strategy for provision of green space, provision of education infrastructure, provision of health infrastructure. Because if there's going to be a cluster of tall buildings here, then we're talking about essentially putting a fair amount more extra people. So like, you know, the equivalent of say 5,000 people, possibly 6,000 to 8,000 people over the course of a period of time there. So like, yes, about the green space contribution that was mentioned, but there doesn't seem to be anything in place for that green space contribution to go towards, so that people can access green space, which is a big worry for me. And in terms of like amenities for the people that live there, I understand that there's the outside spaces have been provided, but I question how usable they would be with the amount of wind mitigation that has to be at ground level. The terrace area would only be a floor above that. So surely there would be something of a wind. I mean, I'm not a technical expert or anything, but just looking at the layout of the building in relation to the next door building, like it looks like there could be a wind tunnel there. So I question the wisdom of the lack of plan for the green space and for all of the, you know, health infrastructure, all the other stuff that you need for large developments like that. E-law has many iterations, and yet we're talking about a higher concentration of people in a smaller area. So that means that the space that's being used needs to be used much more wisely. So I'd just like to hear a bit about that, please.
In terms of the general things like health and education, there would be a SIL requirement, so that would be 211,451, which would go to sort of general those general servicing requirements. In terms of the provision of green space, the proposal is what's in front of us. So we've been given a proposal that has the amenity space provided for residents to be offset by a commuted sum, and then there's obviously a process through which that commuted sum is allocated in the locality, which is kind of beyond the planning process.
Again, I'm trying to keep out of it today. Health, yeah, really, I am, honestly, I am. No, sorry, one of the questions there I think really perhaps should be put to the applicant was about how usable would the space be with wind mitigation when we get to that particular point. So I think that can be put to the applicant. I mean, health and education is an interesting one because we've said this many times. These days, it's effectively private providers that are doing that. So although the education department can identify that there's a need, ultimately it's the private providers that come forward and provide that. And health, likewise, is actually a business these days with the doctors that operate in that particular area to seize the opportunity and come in. So you can't really answer that in terms of linking the provision. The green space contribution, good to hear the members are comfortable with the sum, I think, what was being said there, and where it would go. I think we don't have a strategy as such. I was just asking Jonathan about the city centre area, but I think the best thing to do for us is to come back and show and demonstrate when we do get to a report that's a decision of where it could be spent within the city centre to provide that provision. But I say the last question about the usability of the space, I think perhaps should be put to the architect, if that's okay, Chair.
Yes, thank you. I will bring in Councillor Manaka.
Thank you, Chair. With regards to, you know, the pockets of, I think we've spoken a lot about wind mitigation. I think the first question I've got is, if I'm looking at the, you know, the pictures that have been given, we do need to have a where people can kind of like walk. It seems as if those wind mitigating things are a lot in that space. Is there enough for people to be able to walk and you know, and not have too much of it? Again, I think it just goes back to the two councillors, their questions there. And I think number two with wind mitigation, if we look at previous buildings and planning that's been approved before, there's a lot in the city centre of Leeds. There's a lot of kind of like where it can kind of like formulate a pocket of air that sort of blows the wind in between the buildings. Is there something more to this that they can put rather than what we see at the moment? It's just those kind of questions I think I have for them. I will return back with other questions. I think I still have a lot. Thanks, Chair.
So, with regard to the ability for people to walk, again, as I said before, it's still an ongoing kind of situation, and we will be looking at it. The imagery that we've got so far suggests that there's enough space for people. So obviously we'll have to give that a bit more scrutiny. And I just missed the second half of the question, if you could.
Thank you. The second part of it is, say, for instance, I'm giving Bridgewater as an example. With the way the height of this building is 32, 36 stories. We have the first phase, and we've got this new building that's just closest to it. So I think my question is, are we not, we're concentrating on the bottom part of wind mitigation? Is it that it will not kind of like deflect from the top and just bring all the air and the wind in between these? And I think that's my question. I don't know if I'm putting it correctly, but, yeah.
Chair, again, perhaps that's a question of the applicant. I get where you're going with that. The wind mitigation at the moment basically is around the periphery, the base of the building, isn't it? But you're suggesting, has the building itself been designed to actually impact upon that potential downforce at the top of the building, and whether there's measures there? So I think, again, that's something to pass to the architect in a minute or two, if that's okay.
Okay, Councillor Ray.
Yeah, just coming on to the meeting in a slightly different format, different angle. We are getting a lot more information now that the demographic of the city centre population is changing. We're having more young families, we're having more retiree communities, and obviously I'm really happy to see that the building will be policy compliant on accessibility. But it kind of touches on the green space issue, kind of touches on the amenity. We're going to have a lot of families in this area with young children in very short order, not just on this, there'll be some in this development, there'll be some in the composite developments nearby. And therefore it begs the question, as much as in principle, actually, if you weren't looking at that type of amenity space, actually probably the green space provision would be acceptable. What are we doing to actually cater for the fact that we know there are going to be families, and the fact that we have 2 and 3 bedroom properties kind of indicates we know there are going to be some families in the area. And actually, so there's that. And the second bit is also, there's some external community space, and there's the gym. Where is there for people to sit down and chat? Where's the community room so that they can actually do other things? It's something, again, we're speaking to a lot of developers about now, and doesn't seem to be coming through, that actually there needs to be a community space which isn't gym related, isn't sitting outside related. It's a space where let's say it's 36 stories, where all those people can come together as a mini community and actually just sit down and have a coffee together or have a games night. So has there been some sort of internal community space, not just external community space?
Yeah, I'll put that to the applicants shortly. Councillor Taylor?
Mine was similar to Councillor Ray with the children. Leeds is a child-friendly Leeds, and 3 bedrooms is a family property. So where are the kids to play in all this? Go back to Councillor Brooks with green space. I've seen anything at all inside it for young people to play. We know what young people like. cannot locked in a room 24/7. There's no green space, there's no park. You showed the gym, you showed other places that will accommodate adults. But what about the young people who would live in that environment? Where would they go? And that's my big concern.
Thank you. Again, that's probably more to the applicants. The final three that wanted to speak, are any of those specifically to officers, or shall I move on to applicant? If you can re-indicate if you'd like to ask a specific question to officers. Yes? Don't worry at all. Okay, Councillor Buckley, we'll come to you now and we'll gamble it.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure where this actually comes, but we're talking about here about families with 3 bedrooms and walking. If it's all great and cycling, I agree with this. But I know they mentioned there are only 18 car parking spaces. Now, to me, it seems we have all these properties. So say, for example, in that 3-bedroom property, the people there have 2 cars. So they take up 2 car parking spaces of those 18 car parking spaces. And there are a lot of other residents there who have a car. Where do they park? And then the other question I have to ask, it says on the base of the property that they're having small commercial shops. Yeah. So where are they then going to park if they have a car? It just seems to be there hasn't been enough provision made about the other aspect of it. Apart from walking and cycling, people still do like to have a car. That is my.
Chair, yeah, I mean, it is just on the periphery of the city centre, so the car parking requirements are less. I mean, it has been assessed by our highways office, and Catherine can be invited to come into comment further. As it stands at the moment, I think we've got support for the measures that have been provided in terms of cycle parking, etc., and alternative measures. But we have to remember that it is literally just across the railway line from the city centre where the requirement for car parking is less. But I don't know if you want to comment further, Catherine.
Thank you, Chair. So the location within the fringe, the parking standards is really a maximum and we don't have a minimum, as long as you can demonstrate there is no detriment to the surrounding streets. So this is complemented by the measures in the travel plan. There is the car clubs that we are going to convert 3 pay and display bays to car clubs. And those have been shown on other residential sites to really work where parking is low. We have also sought TRO contribution of 10,000, whereby we will try and protect any areas if parking problems arise. And then we talked about the contribution towards the cycle scheme that's coming up on Whitehall Road. So with all the travel plan measures, we believe that we are trying, we declared the climate emergency. The transport strategy is all about mode shift from the car. So we have assessed the car parking provision to be adequate, coupled with the measures that are within the travel plan and the contributions.
Again, just chuck one more thing in. Some members may or may not be aware that the Leeds City Council is actually involved in a scheme for introducing electric bicycles into the city. And although the first phase is running from the city centre north, there are plans obviously to run that scheme out to the peripheral areas, including in that direction. So there will be that on top of everything else that Catherine said in the near future. So there'll be people whizzing about on their electrical bikes and can live from wherever, and the batteries will be charged, etc., etc. It's not in the first phase, but it does include that area ultimately.
Lovely. Next on the list is Councillor Gavani. Lovely. In which case, I'll move straight to Councillor Rowntree, please.
Great. Thank you, Chair. On the parking tack, I'd absolutely like to believe that the 18 places are sufficient. I think, well, the chair will know I'm a very reluctant motorist. I don't use the car if I can possibly avoid it. I do understand totally that the way to discourage superfluous car use does involve constraining parking spaces, because if parking spaces are provided, they will inevitably be filled. I'm just wondering if the officer from Highways, who's, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, can give us some assurance that there's evidence from what we've already done. Are there examples of large residential developments like this in the city centre where this kind of ratio has been shown to work? If there are, then I'll be extremely happy.
The example I can give is one that has not yet been constructed, but we have a site in, I think it's Dandara site, where Travelwise has been monitoring. I can't recall the parking ratios there, but we've definitely approved this same ratio of parking for a site that's on the front of the viaduct on the Doncaster Monks Bridge viaduct. And we shall, in addition, have a car park management plan that should ensure that we don't get problems, or the developer themselves, because that is conditioned. I don't know what's going to be contained in there. We can discuss with the developer on what needs to go into the car park management plan.
And again, because this is a position statement, obviously we can seek out what examples we've got that are actually built in addition to what Catherine said. So when we bring it back, we can give you some better idea of whether it's actually working in other areas.
It'd be useful perhaps to look at other areas in the country as well where it's working or not working. Councillor Ray.
On the parking, so first quick question, what's the legal minimum we can ask for? Sorry, legal maximum, should I say, in terms of what is the ratio, the maximum ratio we can request for a city centre location?
So according to the standards, the maximum would have been 280 spaces.
For this site?
Yes.
And we're going for 18. Right, so, okay, so I'm a city centre councillor. And I have lots of city centre sites where there's been wonderful magical ideas that you'll limit car parking spaces. And guess what? Everybody tries to buy a car and then they all compete for the city centre car parking spaces, which we're reducing, and it causes numerous conflicts. But on a more fundamental point, it's actually about one of the 3 sustainability targets we have as a council when we're looking at development. You restrict the number of car parking spaces so severely, you start to create a particular demographic of person that moves into that apartment block. That then starts creating an unsustainable community with high turnover on a regular basis, because actually the particular demographic is going to be substantially younger, substantially more mobile, and actually creating an area which is truly sustainable, both in terms of its population mix, in terms of its impact on the local economy, and therefore what services you put in, such as those green space provisions, such as those play provisions, makes a huge impact. So unless we're actually designing by intention to create this to be a space for younger people who are highly mobile without a car, and therefore intentionally creating a development which is therefore intrinsically unsustainable in community terms, as well as probably in economic terms in the long term, 18 car parking spaces is ridiculous. And I'm sorry, if the idea that you'd have that many flats and only 18 parking spaces is just beyond, I'm sorry, no.
Is there a question there, Councillor Ray?
Rephrase, has actually the actual social demographic impact of that parking capacity been considered in terms of actually making this a building which is sustainable in the long term?
What's up with you guys? Come on. No, seriously, I understand the question completely that was there at the end, because it was more of a comment, and because of the way the city council has drawn up its sustainability policies within the city, actually in terms of this particular scheme, I think the answer would have to be no, but it's because of the way the policies are actually drawn for these sort of locations with these towers. We're not required to. Yeah, I don't know how to take that forward. We'll try and answer the question when we come back. But as I say, the policy context that we have in these areas for this tower wouldn't require us to actually go into that sort of detail, Councillor Ray.
So just to be clear, we're saying that our current policy framework does not account for long-term social, economic, community sustainability in the city centre. Is that what we're saying as a local authority right now?
No, I'm not actually saying that. What I'm trying to say is that the way it's drafted, it has a different tack on what's considered to be acceptable to what you're putting forward. I think that's the answer to that. But that's it. But I'll just reiterate this. That obviously is an adopted council stance as it stands at the moment.
I think it is an interesting point, though, and one as chair that I'm really happy to take forward. Councillor Brooks.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to agree in terms of like the level of car parking is incredibly low. But I'd like to just ask a couple of questions about the I guess like the massing and the density. I mean, I've already sort of touched on the density, but are we sure, right? Are we sure that as a local authority, are we sure that the number of units that are included in this development and the sort of height and scale and massing, density, all of that stuff stacks up? Are we sure about that? Like, it's quite a, I suppose, straightforward question, but it's also, yeah.
Well, it meets the density policy because the density is a minimum requirement. So it meets density 400 in 0.3 of a hectare. It meets policy by miles. So the simple answer is yes from planning policy terms.
Is that the only thing that's taken into account though? Because I mean, you know, there's, in terms of the national planning policy framework, I mean, it's all written down in the report that you so kindly put together, but it's, you know, achieving sustainable development, delivering a sufficient supply of homes. Yes, of course it does that. Building a strong competitive economy. I'm not sure about that. Promoting healthy and safe communities. I'm not sure that that's been, like, you know, we've been talking about green space, been talking about like access to health infrastructure, education. Councillor Ray just touched on whether this development is designed to be a long-term sustainable place to live, or whether it's more targeted towards people who are not going to be around for a long time. Making effective use of land. I mean, I'm not sure that the amount of wind mitigation that's got to be put in place is an effective use of land. Achieving well-designed spaces, similarly, like, is it really a well-designed space if that amount of wind impact has to be there? Conserving and enhancing the natural environment when there's no street trees. Like, yeah, I struggle to see how this proposal is policy compliant.
That's a statement.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that a statement again, a comment rather than a question? I mean, all I can, sorry. All I can say in respect of that is that if we've not articulated well enough in the report, that when we do come back with the application for a decision, we'll obviously try harder and do better in terms of convincing members of what we said about the policy compliance with regard the the bits that have been created. And the wind mitigation, of course, we will be coming back anyway with further detail, because that we know that has to be considered further. So see, most of that as a question actually was, I suppose, going back to look at the sort of policies that have already been accepted by the council. So all I can do is we can go away and try and articulate that better in terms of answering those questions. Thank you, Chair.
In the report, should it be brought back, we'd be able to, I guess, put a paragraph under each of those so that that explanation is there or isn't there.
I think we've given training to members to understand that policies pull in lots of different ways. So it's not just a checklist that you have to go through for the national planning framework. You can't just say that's a pass, that's a pass, that's a pass. It depends on the development. Sometimes you'll have to pull away from a particular aspect of the framework, but it's for you as a decision maker to decide whether overall it complies with policy, and B, does it result in sustainable development. I appreciate that you're just asking questions, but I really think we need to be cautious about a checklist approach when we're looking at development. That was just a comment that I wanted to make.
Thank you. Councillor Nacker?
Thank you, Chair. And again, please do forgive if this question is not for the officers, rather to the developers. With the, I think, level housing mix and level, I do apologize. I'm just going to go on my notes quickly there. I know that there is something to consider on floor 2, 3, 4, and 30. I think my question here is, are those which are for 3 bedrooms, which are for single bedrooms and stuff? I think my question will then lead on to safety. If we are to possibly have, say, for instance, 3-bedroom. I'm just going to have an assumption that it would be a family house, and there is no balcony outside for them to be, to have space for kids. Are there, I know that you would possibly consider Juliet railings and stuff like that. I think I want to understand on these floors, where will be the family units for safety? That's all I think my question. Thanks, Chair.
So for the 3-bed units, they'll all be on level 30 to 33. And there are no balconies in the development, so it'll be all internal.
But will they consider Juliet railings around those? The ones that I've just seen used on the, the building that's next to it. There's some railings there, just kind of like.
No, I think the design, the applicant might take this a bit further, but the designs sort of hermetically sealed glazing units.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Ray, who's already indicated, and then if I can do one final, if any members would like to make questions to officers, and then I'm going to move it to open to questions to the applicant.
Should we assume for the moment that the panel agrees on the housing mix and the parking, which I've got a feeling we won't agree with, but in general, are we able to condition that there is an allocated parking space per affordable, because bear in mind they are more likely to be used because of the size towards the family end, so that they at least have a guarantee of some form of parking in that space?
It's got to be 10 years line, isn't it?
Sorry, yes, Chair. We can look at whether the 3 beds can be provided with parking space. We'd have to discuss it with the applicants and whether the mix would change the results of the debate today. But we can certainly look at resolving that.
Lovely. Okay, the final indication then was Councillor Rowntree. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask a question related to the relationship between the 2 phases. I think it's particularly pertinent to that. to do with sunlight. And I noted within the report there's a reference to partial information being available about the I think it's the implications of glare from the point of view of the railway goods yard. But certainly there was a sense that more information will be welcome about the implications of shadow and glare from the building. Will we be able to obtain some more clarity on that in the succeeding phases, so we understand better what the implications of this the materials of the tower, I think, essentially is concerned.
Yes. Yeah, we can ensure that further information is submitted and scrutinised on that. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And allied to that, I'm just wondering with the aluminium and glass construction, and I think this may be broader just than the implications for phase one, who closest to it and see it, but how is this material likely to weather and wear over years ahead? I mean, I'm just sort of thinking it's very bright and glistening in the illustrations here. I'm just wondering, would it look the same way 30, 40, 50 years time? Obviously, the nature of aluminium is that it will weather, I think, less than a lot of traditional building materials, but I'd just like to know a bit about that. Thank you.
Okay. We'll it's okay. I think I've got it. So we'll move now to questions to the applicants. Councillor Rowntree, I'll pass that one over as well in terms of how we're expecting the materials to weather. I think the key points that have been raised so far for the applicants are the high wind mitigation, whether or not some more could be done higher up. That means there's less on the ground level. Whether there's access to us putting a community space in internally, car parking spaces and car parking spaces around the commercial element. And then I'm going to take a liberty as chair and ask a couple myself, which is I would like to see if we're having play areas, i.e. a gym for adults, I'd like to see soft play inside for young people as well. And then also for me, if you haven't got a garden and you've got children, then you'll have things like football, scooters, possibly bikes that need somewhere. Bikes less so because they could go in the bike rack, of course, but things for playing outside with, but nowhere outside, such as a shed to store it. So how are we going to make sure that there's provision within the properties for that type of storage for kids' outdoor play stuff? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and go through a few of the questions and hand over to Andrew. There's obviously a lot of questions about the wind mitigation in terms of orientation and the scale of the mitigation that we are proposing. As a tall building, it's been assessed through CFD and a wind tunnel down in Imperial College, London. And effectively what it shows is that the main risk to sort of the wind conditions are from the east and southeast. They're sort of the primary directions of the strong winds. So the orientation of the building, as was mentioned by officers, does allow the building to turn into the winds and offer the gable end, the slimmest element of the end, which does reduce the impact of the wind throughout the scheme. There's a question about the sort of the funneling of the wind between the two phases. It's true the wind does hit the western facade or the northwestern facade of the building and get brought down towards the garden level. But one thing that is required as part of the wind mitigation is to respond to issues of safety first, and then also comfort. So the wind mitigation proposed deals with the safety factors first, and ensures that there's no risk to safety for pedestrians, cyclists walking past the development, or pedestrians, residents within the development. And then in terms of comfort, again, the proposal ensures that the environment at ground floor and at first floor in the shared garden space is sufficient, that people can sit comfortably, can walk comfortably, and actually can enjoy the space rather than worry about obviously the impacts of the wind. So a lot of the landscaping proposed for the first floor garden space is designed to perform two functions, visually to be attractive, but also it's there to help ensure that comfort level is provided at the first floor level. In terms of the community space, that's it's an interesting question. It's something obviously we can take to the client. I guess we are providing a lot of in relative terms the amenities for residents. The gym space and the swimming pool is something that we haven't designed on other schemes, city centre schemes, but it does, the space is so generous that it does actually give the opportunity to actually think about internal play space for the children's gym, and just to add to the spaces on site that are suitable for families. Obviously we would see the protected area at first floor in terms of the terrace as being a suitable and safe environment for children to play. And in the unlikely event that it rains in Leeds, there's also the covered internal sky garden at the top of the building, which again is a safe environment, an open environment, and one which can offer views across the city. So and at top floor, on the top floor, there's also an external play area, amenity space, stroke play area, which is uncovered, but is, in terms of the questions about safety, just want to provide total comfort on that in terms of the external space on the top of the building is actually surrounded by a 3 meter high sort of glazed wall, which obviously ensures that there's no risk of people looking over a balcony, and also again at that level it's there to provide the comfort levels because of the wind speeds at that height. Sorry, I'll
just whilst Nick looks at a couple of things there, I'll just touch on in terms of that amenity space again, that will go through a design development as we go forward, subject to exactly how that comes forward. There's ideas that were provided in the presentations, glossy images, things like that. What I've actually seen on a lot of other city centre schemes, there are it's all shared coffee shops and things like that, where it's actually free to use coffee. It's all sort of within your ground rent, that type of thing. They have moving partitions, so those spaces changed for whatever event is going on, whether it's a community meeting, whether it's a yoga session, whether it's again more sort of workspace orientated, and it's sort of partitioned up a little bit more. So that's certainly something that has that flexibility. It comes through the detailed design, and we'll take on board and perhaps either provide some more imagery or some detail on that coming forward next time. With regard to some of the football storage element, there is a requirement within the adopted core strategy policy in the NDSS about having internal storage in units, and again we're compliant with that point. Again, in terms of some of the both internal and external amenity, there's that ability to do storage as well there, which again will be for communal use, communal footballs, of course, rather than your individual ones. Likewise, in the parking area that we've talked about, there's a requirement for bins, for bikes, for cars. There's the site isn't massive as we've talked about, but we've heard the comments today as to how we perhaps still look to potentially move that around, accommodate other things, which may include storage as well. That's often included within storage space. And I think I'll let Nick come back in.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, there was, in terms of the wind mitigation, there was a question about the intensity of wind mitigation at ground floor level, and obviously the images do show a number of these tree-like sculptures at ground floor in front of the building. But what the images struggle to do is just give a sense of the scale, because of the scale of the building. So the sculptures are predominantly sort of 5 to 6 meters apart. So in terms of a sense of scale, it's probably from the columns almost to the outside of the desk on that side. So you know, if you imagine the column was at similar scale to the base of the structure, that would mean we have quite a wide, open, generous space between the structures. And you notice that on the images that the base of the structures, there's also an area where people can sort of sit and read and chat. So I just wanted to give that sense of scale, which is, there's plenty of space to walk between, and enjoy the sort of quality of the environment down there. There was a question about sunlight and glare. We have, as the officers mentioned, we have provided some notes on the sunlight aspect, and again the orientation of the two phases, and the fact that actually the scale of the first phase sort of steps down towards Springwell Road. It all is designed to ensure that the amount of sunlight in that central space is optimized, and optimized at sort of the important parts of the day in terms of sort of late morning, lunchtime, and during the afternoon, where the sun is at its highest and warmest, and when activity is at its greatest. The glare aspect, obviously we are close to the railway line, and it's something that obviously we need to take seriously. We've run the exercise in terms of identifying, I think there's 5 signals within 150, 200 yards of the building on the main line into and out of the station. We've run the exercise in terms of the 10-degree view for the drivers within the train, to make sure that there's no risk of glare from the building obscuring the views for the drivers, and it's proven that there's no risk to the drivers of the train. So that's an exercise we've run, and I'm content that so that key issue has been resolved. There was again reference to the aluminium and glass. The sort of typical design life of the cladding will probably be about 60 years for the cladding system. It's, predominantly it's going to be a unitized curtain walling system, all manufactured within a factory environment, brought to site in probably sort of 3 meter by 3 meter panels, which reduces the risk of sort of damage and through construction on site. Therefore, the performance of the materials, particularly the finish to the aluminium, there'll be less risk of that deteriorating over time if there's no actual damage to the face of the cladding, and therefore that 60-year life is realistic. And obviously the building will be maintained over the years by the management company. It'll be maintained by a gantry system which comes from the top of the building and works works its way around the building, both in terms of cleaning the building, but also maintaining the cladding over the years. There was a question about location of affordable housing. As the officers mentioned, the 1 and 2 beds are located on levels 2, 3, and 4, I think, and then the 3 beds are located on level 30. We've been involved in a number of schemes in the city centre where where we've wanted to provide the affordable housing on site, and the process that our clients have to go through is a process of offering those apartments to the housing associations in the area, and the uptake on the apartments that are offered to the housing associations is zero. And there's a number of reasons why we are giving as to why these apartments are not attractive, and one of them is the cost of managing the apartments, obviously isolated from the housing association sort of centre of operations. So the reason we've located the 1 and 2 beds close together on floors 2, 3 and 4 are to minimize the journeys between the apartments for the management side, and therefore hopefully to make them more attractive for housing associations to take them up and to use them on the site. I think that's
I think the only one of the questions that I remember that hasn't been touched on is car parking.
Yes, sure. Yes, we briefly mentioned it. There were a couple officers have covered the policy position in great detail and the elements then which are layered into the scheme to ensure it is policy compliant with regard to the car club, the travel plan, the cycle parking provision, the sustainable travel fund, the bike hire scheme as well. That's coming in as well, that we've seen on a couple of other schemes. That will get expanded, of course, as we've mentioned next time. I'll probably just add in the Section 106 will include a requirement to assess the traffic regulation orders in the area. It's normally an 800-metre radius from the site to ensure that there's not the ability to park on street in the surrounding areas, which that 800 metres will get us towards some of those more traditional residential properties in Holbeck that we've talked about. So it makes sure that it's only those residents that can park in there, and no one from this site has the ability to do that. And of course, once you get to beyond that 800 metres, you're not going to park your car there and be walking in and out. It's a significant distance, even if people were to consider that. Another just sort of point to add into the discussion, we're hearing from a lot of developers that the spaces in their existing buildings that are perhaps historic and schemes that provided a bit more parking over the years are just being hired out to commuters, and then the residents aren't using them, as some of the older residents moving out perhaps. Again, it's a generational thing perhaps, and it's just a type of approach. If you live in the city centre, there's that acceptance more so that you don't have a car. That's the feedback where certainly getting to that goes into some of it, in addition to say a lot of the officers are wanting us to push the parking numbers down to zero in schemes very close to here that have been approved in that respect. With regard to the commercial parking, again, that there isn't a requirement for parking for commercial units in this highly sustainable location. What there is a requirement for is the servicing, and that's where we've looked at that closely with regard to phase 1 and phase 2 linking together in terms of the lay-bys, etc., provided for them.
Right. Apologies, Chair. If I can just add to the parking answer. There's a very good example in terms of evidence for this scheme in the city centre, and that is phase 1, where the provision for parking is 57 spaces for 224 apartments, and the evidence that has been all the apartments have now been sold, but all of the parking spaces haven't been taken up, and there's quite a number which haven't. So you know, based on that evidence, that we have sort of comfort that the requirement for a parking space, you know, will not be significantly more than the 19 spaces that are being provided on the site. Added to which we've got the car club spaces as our officers mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Can I bring in Councillor Gavani?
Thank you, Chair. In the report we've got, it says the 39 3-bed units is not an insignificant number of family units. It then goes on to say that the level of amenity space provided is not necessarily geared towards children and would likely appeal to a different demographic. What sort of demographic family unit are you talking about? Is that liable to be geared towards?
I suppose that's in the officer report, so we didn't write that. Certainly in terms of the 3 beds, there's an expectation, and often the case, that there's that mix. There will be some families that will take that. There will be some sharers. These are for sale apartments. They're not built to rent, which are a lot of the tenure that we've seen come forward in the city centre more recently. So these could be bought by family. They could be bought by sharers, and that can be either way. So whether the report is starting to indicate that, I'm not sure, but whether that wants to go back to officers in terms of the writing there. In terms of the amenity that's provided with it, we've talked about how we can look at giving a flavour more so in terms of the different type of amenity space that can be provided, not just your coffee shop type space, your workspace, but also the soft play and the more informal play in that sense.
Okay, members, any final questions to the applicants? No? Okay, in which case, unless officers have anything they want to add? No, lovely. So today we are, as members, providing comments in relation to the 10 questions that have been given. What I'll do is I'll go through the questions, and then if you can indicate if you have any comments that you would like to make. So question 1, and I wasn't going to read them out, but as that's been quite a long process, I will. So do forgive me, anyone watching with it in front of them. Do members continue to support the principle of a residential tower in this location? I'm seeing nodding. Anyone adverse in response? No? Okay, great. Question 2, if so, do members support the height of the tower at 36 stories? No? Can I get some comments around that rather than just no? Is there? Yes, Councillor Buckley.
I don't know. Oh, yeah. To me, it seems as though it's slightly overbearing for the area in relation to the surrounding property. I mean, I know that there probably will be development later, but it seems to completely overshadow the one that is being built at the moment, and I think it's too high.
Councillor Gavani.
Yeah, very similar comment to Councillor Buckley. It does seem to be overbearing. And the report in front of us says there'll be shadowing, there'll be no lack of direct sunlight to the existing block. I think it's one block too tall. There may be others coming, but I think at the moment, no.
Any other comments on that question? Okay, in which case, question 3. Do members support the design of tower, including the use of materials? People are pretty affirmative. Yeah, excellent. Do members support the proposed housing mix?
We always like more, but we know it's policy.
So we're content that it meets policy. So it's fine. Okay. Question 5, do members support the provision of affordable housing across floors 2, 3, 4 and 30? Councillor Brooks.
I can't, if there's a sort of management kind of argument around the affordable housing being all in the same area, I don't then understand why the 3 beds are so far away. It seems really illogical to me. I know it's just the 3 units, but like, it's not logical then, the argument that's been put forward about that.
It almost feels like it should be 27, 28, 29 and 30 if you were going to block them. Councillor Manaka?
Thank you, Chair. I think I echo the same to Councillor Brooks. It's possibly the level where the 3-bedroom is at. And I think for me, it's if I could have something that says if a family's in there, the kids will be safe, or, you know, their pets will be safe, or something along those lines, really. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, I was just discussing a point with Jonathan at the point Councillor Brooke raised her point. Could I just ask that you repeat what you were saying there so I capture it properly? Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, the argument has been put forward by the applicant that from a management point of view by registered providers, that they don't want to take on units that are far apart from each other, like pepper potted as would be policy compliant. So it doesn't make any sense, therefore, that the affordable housing provision is allocated at levels 2, 3, 4 and 30.
Any other questions on number 5 and the affordable housing locations? No comments? Okay. Question 6 then. Do members consider the levels of amenity provided for residents to be sufficient? I'm getting shakes, so can I have some comments, please, Councillor Ray?
This goes back to the point we were talking earlier about actually one of the sustainability strands. And actually, there are lots of gyms in the city. That space could be better utilised for things like proper community space where people can go. I appreciate the point being made about a flexible cafe space, etc. But these are vertical villages with very little actual true community space that isn't outdoors or isn't in a bar or isn't somewhere. So I think it's not that the aspiration for community space isn't good, but I think the proposal they're putting forward is geared to a particular type of customer base, which is not long stay, not family. They're going to be there for 6 months to 18 months and then they will move on. And that comes to the sustainability point we raised earlier. I think they can do a better mix, which makes this sustainable within our policy framework as it is. And they just need to be a bit more creative.
I think for me, if I'm allowed to make a comment as well. Yeah, good. Just checking. Doesn't normally stop me, but just checking this time. I think for me, it's the perfect amenity if you were building a hotel, but not the perfect amenity for a community. Any other comments on question 6? No? Okay. In which case, question 7. Do members consider the relationship between phases 1 and 2 to be acceptable?
No, because we said no to question 2.
So it is just a case of the height is the only issue with the phasing. Councillor Brooks?
I'd say it's not just a height, it's also, there's a problem with like street trees and softening, like if the proposed height is what comes in as a full application, right, then yeah, there's a height problem with that, but then it's also about the landscaping between the two sites, and it's about the pedestrian journey between the two sites and through the site and everything else. So yeah, I'd say it's not just about the answer to question 2, it's a load of other stuff as well.
Any further comments on that question? Number 7? No, okay. Question 8 then. Do members consider the provision of funding towards local green space projects an acceptable alternative to on-site provision? Councillor Brooks?
I would say that if there are no green space projects in the pipeline in the immediate locality within maybe 1 or 2 minutes walking distance of the locality, then it's not acceptable, because if you've got that density of people, and again, I'm talking about it being potentially a 36-storey, right? if you've got that density of people and no proper green space for those people to access, that is not acceptable, and we shouldn't be accepting it in Leeds.
Councillor Ray?
I actually think, bearing in mind its relative location, it probably is acceptable just on the sheer basis that I know you disagree, just on the sheer basis that actually to get to the quantum that we would probably be comfortable with, you'd have no site to develop on. And I think though we've obviously talked about the particular issue around, not that it creates a precedent, but it kind of does create a precedent without creating a precedent in terms contextual precedent. I like the way that's phrased. Then actually what we're then starting to apply onto other developments in the areas that actually they're going to have to surrender more and more space to green space, which actually makes those sites unviable. I'm just making the point. I just think actually for the ward members in that area, you know, I do accept to a certain extent that there is a certain type of demographic that moves into the city centre, and that actually that money could be utilised very well by the ward members for the other existing green spaces. So I think in principle, we should have more on site, and there are questions over the biodiversity, which we haven't talked about. But in principle, under policy terms, it is what it is, and we would lose that point if we were to try and argue any further on a legal point. But that's my.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Councillor Manaka because she indicated first.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just as a point really, or maybe something for developers to consider. If you go, and I don't know whether that will fall within the regulations and all. If you go down Wellington Street, there's been some buildings around there regards to green space. I think they've kind of like used it lovely, you know, possibly just around the Wellington. I know that Wellington is more commercial rather than housing, but they've I think they've used that, you know, with the context of it being in the city centre, but they've used it lovely, and I think it would be nice to consider. I don't know. Thank you, Chair.
So, Chair, just because I will come back and summarise these, because unfortunately that task will fall to me down. But I think it's an interesting point, and the slight difference of opinions on the between Councillor Brooks and Councillor Ray there. I think that's really partly for us to work with the applicant in terms of the green space that is existing in the area, whether it can work. The money can be utilised to enhance that, but also potentially with the ward members in the area, because obviously there will be an opportunity for them to become involved in spending of that money. So I think if we work with the applicant and the ward members and also try and analyse what's already there and where it could be utilised, I think that might help when we come back to panel, if that's okay.
Councillor Brooks.
Yeah, I was talking specifically about like the contributions need to be pooled potentially between several different sites to create new, very close to the site green space, because off-site contributions isn't going to cut it when you've got that density of people and the amount of distance that you'll have to walk or get in a car and drive to a green space. So I'm talking about there needs to be some plan in place to make sure that all of those off-site contributions are actually impactful for the people who are going to be living in the developments that are coming forward, not just this one, but in that area.
I think that's probably the difficulty of them being individual developments instead of a whole estate, isn't it?
Sorry, Chair, can I? Again, as I understand the point that Councillor Brooks is making completely, and I think it's for ourselves in development management to talk to our policy officers, because they can't really answer that question as to what there is in the immediate area, but I'm sure we can bring something back that hopefully answers that question.
And it'd be useful to have an image of the green space, the designated green space of the area as well. I think it's also about not just the off-site, but utilising the on-site bits that you have got in a slightly more out-the-box way. Certainly, I'm thinking I've got a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old now, and I had previously, as you can imagine, a 2-year-old, because that's how age works. And at 2, she very much just fell over. And especially children with additional needs and such like, actually having big areas of paved space really, as a parent, makes it quite difficult for you to let your kids sort of run, because you know the next thing they're going to do is faceplant. So having areas where there's big areas of like grass with smaller but still DDA compliant paths actually gives a bit more space. And there's a lot of sort of woodland style play areas that kind of basically look like they're just kind of design work, but actually are play equipment for young children. So I think if we look at something a little more out the box with what we've got on site as well, that would certainly make me feel a little more comfortable. Any other comments on question 8? No? Okay, question 9. Are members happy with the low level of parking being offset by the requirement of a contribution towards cycling infrastructure? I think I know the answer.
No. And now I think the point here is actually it doesn't necessarily need to get to the maximum that we require under policy, but there has to be an acceptance that 11% is just low. And I take the point from the developer about, the architect, that if you look at the other sites, that actually it might be underutilized at the moment, but we're building properties that will be here hopefully for a century or more in some cases. And actually what you tend to find is, and we found this with a lot of city centre developments, the first generation of people that move in get it and they don't have a car. And then the second generation of people that move in afterwards go, do you know what? I'd like to be able to drive somewhere. And so you have to, again, this is about the sustainability argument. You have to think forward apart from the first generation of buyers. And thinking just because the first generation don't. I've got lots of estates in my ward around the city centre where the plan was they weren't going to have a car. And guess what? The second lot of people that moved in all bought cars because they weren't bought into the vision of the development. They were bought into the location. And that is materially different. So I'm not saying it has to be, I'm not suggesting it has to be to the full level that we can require. But 18 spaces for a development of this size is just nonsensical. And it's not sustainable in the long term.
Any other comments at all? No? Happy with that? Okay. In which case, we'll move to question 10. Do members consider the amount of wind mitigation required and the emerging design solutions acceptable in principle? Has anyone got any comments on that? No, as in no, you don't have comments, or no, Councillor Brooks?
I mean, we don't. I think overall the panel seems to not be in support of the amount of wind mitigation that will have to be in place. But also, we're also not in support of the density of the development in the height of the development, I suppose, not the density, but the height. It's too tall. So I don't know, it's a bit of a funny question to be asking us.
I do apologise because in retrospect, looking at that question, it's probably not that well phrased. So I do apologise for that, Chair. I think really what we're trying to see out of this, because obviously we know that there's going to be further work to be done around the base of the building in particular. But I think really all we were trying to tease out of members at this stage is that I don't know how to describe them. I don't know how Nick would describe them, but the sort of champagne bowl type tree lattice elements, from my perspective, actually is a good design solution in terms of how it looks. And there is other more formal bits in between. I think that's all we're trying to tease out of you, not the number, because we need to know, obviously, look at the spacing, as Nick mentioned, the issues about the 5 and 6 meters between them. So I think it was just as a starting point, the look of those wind mitigations, because I mean some of them that we have in the city centre now that are on buildings are really quite formal. I can't remember the name of the building, but if you look at the one that's just opposite Marion House that's got the little supermarket at the bottom, they're just quite big steel. Sorry,
Vita student block.
It's the Vita student block. I mean they're just structural rather than particularly aesthetically pleasing. I think that's all we were trying to tease out of it, whether you thought they were aesthetically pleasing, so we can move forward to the actual numbers that's required.
I mean, obviously, we don't like doing design by committee, so obviously the aesthetically pleasing question is probably not the right one. Is the principle of having something that isn't a sheet of metal a good one? Yes.
I'll settle for that.
Yeah. So if it can be done in a way which is architecturally pleasing, we're not going to please everyone, but if there's a variety of shapes that achieve the job and add architectural character that isn't a sheet of metal with holes in it, then I think it's probably the best answer you're going to get.
Councillor Gavani, did you want to covered? Beautiful. In which case, if there's no further comments on question 10, no, in which case we'll move to Steve's summary. Thank you.
Best bit. Question 1, yes. Principle of the residential tower there was accepted. Number 2, I get the impression we think it's too tall. So I'll just park that because I want to come back to that. And there was also an issue about potential overshadowing. 3 was a yes about the materials. 4 was a yes about the general housing mix. 5, affordable housing. There was this question about the separation between them, which obviously we'll discuss with the applicants later and whether it's more appropriate to have them all together. 6, do members consider levels of amenity? Bit mixed. Understand the point about perhaps the gym might be better utilised. I mean, the applicant did actually say at one point that there was the space within the building to perhaps create this sort of flexible areas and internal play spaces for younger, for children, etc. We will obviously look at the amenity space in the area and come back after a discussion potentially with the ward members of what there is in the city that could be utilised and where perhaps the ward members who may be the beneficiaries of any monies, etc., could utilise that. 7, do members consider the relationship between phase 1 and 2? Questions regarding the height. And I could simply say refer to 2 above because that's what we've more or less said. And also the landscaping perhaps needs a bit more softening in the areas between the 2 buildings and to look at the pedestrian experience in terms of how you would walk through the premises and how that could be softened. 8, therewith, just my papers are falling to bits. Funding towards local green space projects, is it an acceptable alternative? There was a question about whether these green space projects might be within 1 to 2 minutes walking distance. So the answer was a bit of a no on that, but we'll work with the applicants to bring further information as to where that space might be, etc., and how it could be utilised by the communities that are not actually within the tower itself, and look at the provision of informal space as well, which we mentioned before. And I note Councillor Manaka's comment about the Wellington Street areas. And then there's reference to what the strategy was within the city for those spaces. So we'll try and come back with further information from our perspective on that. 9, are members happy with the low level of parking? Basically, that was a no, and it had to be an acceptance that 11% is unacceptable. We just need to counter that with our sustainability policies, which do drive applicants towards that sort of level. But we'll look at that, and I get the point about second owners not being bought into the development. And 18 spaces not being enough, so we'll look at that. And then the final one, wind mitigation. I think there was a general consensus that we want something that is aesthetically pleasing, and these may be it if they work as we hope they will. But we'll just look at that coming back. And the slightly provocative question that I just wanted to ask now, and I'm not going to bind anybody to this, but just to give a bit of a steer moving forward. When we were going back all those years to the pre-application discussion, although there was no tacit acceptance of 30 stories, we've got 36 in front of us now, and the developers already reduced it from the 42. Bearing in mind all the other issues that we have to address here, and it might affect the height anyway, are we looking around the 30? Is that what we're considering? Because there was, sorry, Councillor Brooks, just briefly, there was a question asked by Councillor Brooks about how low do you go in a way? How low do you go before you get to a point where there's no wind mitigation? Of course, that is very low. So I don't think we're at that end I'm just trying to give a bit of an idea, because obviously from the applicant's perspective, the amount of money and effort that's gone into designing the scheme at this point is quite significant. And obviously there's going to be a threshold, and we may be at it at 36 where it becomes unviable. So I just wanted to get a bit of an idea if 30 felt about right, but take into account all the other issues that have been identified in questions 1 to 10.
Councillor Brooks.
The previous pre-application, I believe, was 24. And members, I mean, if we're being bound to pre-application numbers, 24 would be the maximum that I would be comfortable with.
By a point there, you weren't really bound by any of those numbers ultimately. Just to make some members understand the situation, because I was there at that particular panel, the applicant's presentation in terms of the graphics showed a 24, and I think I've certainly got them on the presentation today and you've seen them, but actually at the plans panel, the members did also discuss a 30-storey option. Neither were actually, as I say, agreed in that respect, but the panel, when it was agreeing to the concept of a tall building, was aware of the potential for a 30-storey building. I'm just trying to get a bit of a steer for the applicants, but I know that all the other things that have been raised here may affect that anyway.
Councillor Ray, and then I'll come back to you, Councillor Brooks.
I think it's a hard one to get, because it's obviously going to be about us weighing up harm and benefit. And actually, if we get more benefit for it being slightly towards the 30 mark rather than the 24, then that's obviously going to dictate the kind of conversation we have. And so I think it's really hard for us to make a hard and fast judgment on that, because actually, if they come back and 95% of the things we've asked for are attainable, but it's a 31-storey building, that's certainly better than a 36-storey building. Yeah. But they've got, and so I think it's a really hard one for us to make a judgment on, because it's about how much of the other stuff they can deliver.
Councillor Brooks.
It's not a difficult one for me. So it was minuted at the last meeting of the pre-application meeting. 24 was minuted. So like that should, I mean, I don't really understand, because on the one hand you're going, oh yeah, this has to be because in this pre-app and blah blah blah, so you have to agree to this because of blah blah blah, but then it was agreed 24 at a previous meeting. If things that we agree at meetings are not upheld, then there's no point in us having the meetings.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Brooks. Any other comments at all? No? And you're comfortable with that you have enough comments-wise?
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Okay, in which case we'll move to agenda item number 9, which is the date and time of next meeting. It's proposed as Thursday, the 3rd of August, 2023 at 1:30. Just to let you know, I am away, so it won't be me in the chair. Councillor Gruen has very kindly agreed to cover for me, so you'll get a little break from me. And that concludes the business of today's meeting. Thank you for your attendance and contributions, and I now declare the meeting closed.